Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the UCLA Anderson Alumni Association's Friday Faculty Chats. I'm Jill Baldoff, Associate Dean Alumni Relations, and a proud MBA from the class of 1981. We know there are a lot of questions about how best to move forward in these uncertain times and how to adjust our business and our management practices. And who better to share their thoughts than faculty members from Anderson? Today, we are pleased to be joined by Professor Hal Hirschfield from the Marketing Department. Hal is a psychologist with a PhD from Stanford who did a postdoc at Kellogg specifically for psychologists who aspired to be professors at business school. He brings pop culture and private-public collaborations into his classroom. He's won numerous awards here at Anderson, including the Rising Star, the Citibank Teaching Award, and nationally, the 40 Under 40 Top Business School Professors. So we're very lucky to have him with us today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. Hal will be sharing some slides today. After the presentation, we will send them to you via a link with the survey, so you will get copies of the slides. You're all on mute, but we welcome your questions. In fact, we encourage you to ask questions. So please utilize the Q&A feature that you can find on the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Type in your question and Professor Hirschfield will address them in the Q&A portion of the presentation. Please don't use chat to ask questions, but we will take a look at chat just to make sure that everything's running smoothly during the programming. Hal will speak for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, and then he'll follow up with 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Professor Hirschfield.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jill, and thanks to everybody for who organized this. Thanks to all of you guys who have devoted part of your Friday to doing this. I guess I'll never know whether you would have done this if you hadn't been on lockdown, but I'm just going to imagine that you've chosen to do this instead of something else. But you know, I'm deeply appreciative of you spending the time. And when the alumni office reached out to ask if I would do one of these, I thought this would be an interesting opportunity to talk about how decision making, but really how our preferences, feelings, emotions change when we're facing uncertainty. And I just want to be clear about what we're talking about here. There's been decades of research, of course, on how decisions are made under uncertainty, given of course how much uncertainty we face. Just in decision making in regular times, right? We're uncertain about what our future holds. We're uncertain about our decision making process. We can be uncertain about our own preferences, not really even knowing them. And just to be clear, that that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sort of the classic behavioral economics decision making under uncertainty. What I'm hoping to talk more about is how decisions change, how emotions and goals change when we face these sort of broad macro level times of uncertainty. The topic is interesting. I went back, I tried to go into the literature and say, well, what sort of research has been done on decision making under pandemics? Well, it turns out there's not a ton, in part because I guess luckily we're fortunate that we haven't faced so many of these big earth-shattering pandemic type things, or experiences like 9/11 that really sort of shake us to the core and change the way that we interact. Now, that being said, there's a lot of work that's been done in psychology and in marketing and behavioral economics that I think speaks to some of these things. And so that's to some extent what I'm gonna talk about. Now, of course, I think you can look and see that there's some work looking at how some decisions change, right? I just saw this a day or two ago. This represents a change in online interest for selected products for the last 30 days, basically when the quarantine started up through March. And some of this may not be surprising. It turns out that there's a 374% increase in bread makers online. That is not surprising to me. When I look at my Instagram, at least it feels like everybody and their mother is making sourdough. Some of the ones that were more surprising, apparently there's been a 725% increase in dumbbells, and maybe not surprising to you, there's been a huge increase in searches for bidets, almost 400%. directly linked to surges in Cottonelle stock. Now, I think this sort of stuff it's partially amusing. It tells you the type of things that the type of products people are gravitating towards. By the way, we can also look at what happens to businesses, what happens to advertising. We know a little about this sort of thing, judging by past, catastrophic times. So, for example, after the 08 or even during the 08-09 financial crisis, approximately $62 billion, or rather $60 billion of advertising spending just evaporated. So planned advertising expenditures just disappeared. And it actually took about 8 years for the advertising industry to fully recover. And we're starting to see a lot of pullback there from firms, from businesses in this space. So this particular artsy picture from the New York Times, you probably can't see it all that well, but it's a reflection of Times Square, and it's an ad that Coca-Cola put up, and the letters of Coke are socially distanced. And I think if anything right now, what we're seeing is when advertising is being done, it's just to stay relevant and not really to sell something per se. And we're seeing a lot of sort of free giveaway and sort of corporate social responsibility. I mean, from a business perspective, I think firms are doing this to eliminate acquisition costs later on, because if we can get people in the door now and hey, it's socially responsible, that can help out in the long run and possibly help with returning to profitability sooner. So these things are interesting. I think psychologically, they're not as interesting as what I do want to cover today. And so what I want to focus on are consumption patterns and the ways that emotions and goals shift when we have these sort of big events. Now, the focus then really is on the consumer behavior. And these are the sort of two focus areas, the two topic areas that I want to talk about. And we can look a little bit to certain things in life, and I'll talk about those as we move on, but we can look to certain things in life to make some speculations and some predictions about the way things will change. And I just want to be, hopefully I'm not being too nuanced or too careful here, but I just want to be clear that what I'm going to suggest and the type of thoughts I have are to some extent speculation based on research. And I'm going to spotlight a couple. I'll go kind of a deep dive into a couple of research papers, two of which are stuff that I've worked on that that I think of as relevant to this. But in a month, if we go back and watch this and I'm completely wrong, feel free to reach out to me. But know that I'm of course making some guesses here. So we can make some guesses based on say 9/11. So here's a quote that happened that was put out there in October of 2001. And the quote is this: "We cannot let the terrorists achieve the objective of frightening our nation to the point where we don't conduct business, where people don't shop. And Mrs. Bush and I want to encourage Americans to go out shopping." And so, of course, this is George Bush, 2001. And in fact, I actually didn't realize this, or I'd forgotten this. Americans did go out and shop. There was a 6% increase in consumption in that period from October to December. Americans went out and got cars, houses, mortgages, you name it. And that I'm not going to predict that that's going to happen now. Of course, that was a catastrophe of the sort of global political sort, and it had an immediate effect on the economy. But that bounced back. People could actually leave their house and go back to work, and it was also a local impact. Whereas what we're going through right now is a pandemic. It's affecting the economy globally and especially nationally. So we can look at other sort of patterns of consumption that might change. The New York Times had this hard-hitting article about what sort of products consumers might gravitate toward. I particularly like this one. This was just from 2 or 3 days ago, because they spotlight a woman in Venice, California, who's given up her oat milk lattes in favor of these sort of flaming hot Cheetos. And I think this is not necessarily a surprise that we see people gravitating towards nostalgia products, towards comfort products. People want anything that they can have that represents control, that represents a return to times that were more certain and less anxiety laden. Now, I want to actually talk a little bit differently about what sort of things people might gravitate towards, not product-wise, but more from a cultural consumption standpoint. And this work comes out of conversations I had. The work I'll talk about today, by the way, is a lot of it's done with my collaborator, Adam Alter at NYU. Some of this came out of a conversation that he and I had about what happens when we have different mood states, and how do those moods predict the types of things that we gravitate towards. So the classic way of thinking about this is, if you're sad or depressed or anxious, do you then gravitate towards sad, depressing, negative stuff, music, movies, books, etc., or do you try to kind of change your mood and gravitate towards, you know, the stuff that will take you out of it? And clearly, I want to acknowledge there's going to be some individual differences here. Some people will do one thing, some people will do another. Now, we actually went to the literature. Psychology has a lot about how moods and emotions may affect the things that we do, the stuff that we gravitate toward. And so one theory suggests that we use moods as a resource. So we use them to help us feel good, but we could also use moods as a buffer. And so the idea here is that if we're in a particularly good state, you can imagine one that occurs when, say, globally, politically, economically, things are doing better, that may allow us, that sort of those positive emotions may allow us to grapple with and be more open to complexity, darkness, material that can help us gain some insight into our problems, into life itself, etc. This might suggest, this sort of theory might suggest that if we're in a good state, we might actually, ironically, be more willing to deal with and look at sort of negative or darker things. Now, there's another theory out there that suggests that the biggest motivator of behavior is mood repair. The idea is that we are constantly seeking to feel good. Okay, and so what that means is that if we feel good, we're going to try to continue to feel good. But it also means that if we don't feel good, we're going to do the sorts of things that will make us feel good. And this suggests that we would have more of a focus on the things that are simple, lighter, etc. Now, I know I'm not monitoring the questions or Q&A yet, and I'm sure all of you are wondering, well, where does Tiger King fit into here? And that's something that we will talk about, because I cannot tell if that is dark or light or just totally surreal, which is another possibility. But here's the basic idea. We wanted to know, based on different trends in economic performance, what sort of things would consumers gravitate toward? And the mimicking perspective suggests that if the economy is going well, then we are going to seek out sort of light, simple, happy things. If the economy is not going well, then we are going to seek out dark, sadder, more complex things. The mirroring perspective suggests the opposite. It suggests that when things are not good in the economy, we're going to be focused on the light stuff, the simple stuff. But when things are good, then maybe we have the resources to deal with the complexity, the darker things, if you will. And so this is the perspective we went in taking for this. And I want to be clear, we're talking about sort of broad level trends. And maybe in the Q&A, I'm curious sort of what your experiences have been here. And so here's what we did. We decided to look at 4 spaces of cultural consumption, if you will. We looked at books, movies, music, and humor. And I'll show you what we did. And this is research that's just come out. I think we'd love to kind of build on it. But first we started by looking at books. We looked at bestsellers from the New York Times bestseller list, which is kind of widely considered, the gold standard. And for a period of time, and I'll explain the data in just a second, we looked at the books that landed #1 on the bestseller list, and then we also looked at sort of further down the list as well. What we did, how do you tell what books are darker or lighter, it turns out this is relatively easy. There's different genres out there. There are, there's adventure, science fiction, comedy, fantasy, history, romance, this sort of thing. These are what we would consider light genres. And then there are also the heavier ones, crime, horror, mystery, thriller. We didn't just rely on ourselves here. We actually put out surveys to hundreds of people and asked them to classify these different book genres and tell us, do you think of these things as kind of more lighter, simple, or heavier, darker, more complex? And what we wanted to do is look at these books, and we got the bestsellers from a period of 1970 to 2015. Now, how do we measure what's happening in the economy? And does that even matter for moods? Well, we looked at something called the Consumer Sentiment Index. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, but this is a widely validated tool put out by the University of Michigan that every quarter, essentially every month, I think it is now, asks consumers how they feel about general economic trends right now and into the future. And clearly higher numbers represent sort of a more positive take on the economy, lower numbers represent a more negative take on the economy. And this is a more subjective take on the economy. We've also done all these analyses that I'm going to show you. We've also done all of them with more objective takes on the economy, looking at things like unemployment rates. Okay, and by the way, economic performance is in fact correlated with mood. Some really interesting analyses have come out where researchers have tracked the market performance as well as Twitter sentiment. So what sort of emotions are people expressing on Twitter? And you do see that when the market goes up or down, that has an impact on the types of moods that people are expressing. So we think that this is a good representation of what's happening here. So here's what I'm going to show you. And this is, I'm going to show you basically the same thing for the other categories, but I just want to make this clear. We're going to look at what the Consumer Sentiment Index was when light books ended up at #1, and what it was when darker books ended up at #1. And what you'll see here is this. When lighter books ended up at #1, this sentiment index was around 80. And the numbers itself are not as important as the relative comparison, but here's what happened. When darker books ended up #1, the Consumer Sentiment Index was higher. What does this mean? This means we're seeing more of this sort of mirroring pattern here. In other words, when the economy was doing less well, when it's lower, that's when the lighter, airier, simpler books end up doing better. When the economy is actually doing better, that's when people are more willing and able to grapple with complex, darker topics. And by the way, you can look at this across all the different genres here. I'll just show you for the light books. The gray bars represent periods of time when the economy is doing well. The gray bars represent periods of time when the economy is not doing well, and the blue bars when it's doing really well. And what you can see across the board for just about all the genres, when the economy is not doing that well, people gravitate toward these lighter books. And then we see the flip for the darker genres. When the economy is doing better, then people tend to consume and have these books raised to #1 or actually do better on the bestseller list there, okay? Now, we see similar patterns for music. We categorize music in terms of either being happy, lighter major tunes, major key, or in the minor key. We looked at Billboard hits for this period of time, 1955 to 2014. And again, we see a similar pattern here, where when things are going better in the economy, then the more minor key tunes reach #1. And for longer, when things are worse in the economy, then the lighter, cheerier music takes over. And again, we see the same pattern with movies. And then finally, let me just put out one last thing. We decided to look at cartoons as well. To some extent, this was a opportunistic thing. We were able to get in contact with Bob Mankoff, who's the editor, the cartoon editor at the New Yorker, who himself has an incredibly dark sense of humor. When Adam and I met with him, we met with him in the office of the New Yorker, which is in the New World Trade Center. And I said, "You have a beautiful view." And he said, "Yep, you can watch the planes just fly right in." And it took me a minute to understand how dark his joke was there, but he himself seems to like that sort of humor. But what he was able to give us access to was all of the cartoons that the New Yorker had published for the last 6 decades or so. And we went through this labor-intensive process where we had people online, thousands and thousands of people, code these cartoons for being lighter or darker. And I totally recognize that New Yorker cartoons are not always representative of all comedy out there, but it's just a start. So, you know, here's like a light cartoon, right? I'm you from the future. I came back to warn you not to order the scallops. The sauce is a little too creamy. That's a light cartoon. It's a New Yorker cartoon, so no one's gonna laugh out loud, but it's, you know, it's moderately funny. Here's a darker one. These dogs are talking to each other, looking at people, and they say, what you have to understand is that loss, tragedy, dismay, and irony are all basic to the human condition. So, you know, we had people code these online. And then, you know, we also looked at other things. So, you know, we just looked at how funny are they, how easy are they to understand, when did they come out? It turns out that over the years, darker comedy has just sort of taken over. And we mapped that rating of darkness, comedic darkness, to the consumer sentiment index score. And again, we mapped it to unemployment. But here's basically what we found. When consumers are more positive about the economy, darker cartoons tend to be published. When consumers, if you look on the left side, when they're more negative about the economy, that's when you see the lighter, sort of sillier comedy being published, okay, and being what's being submitted by the actual illustrators, okay. So if I can put this all together, and I know some of this is, you know, there's some complexity here, and these are general trends. The basic idea is that with worse economic times, this is when we see people sort of seeking out the lighter, the more airy, the simpler sort of cultural material. And again, these are broad trends. What I don't know is what happens the day something bad happens. You know, the day that we found out we had to go into quarantine, I don't know what that data looks like. I'd love to get Spotify's listens and see what sort of playlists are being streamed, you know, right away. And then how long does it take people to sort of say, I need something to sort of contrast this emotional experience. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But what I want to do before we get there is now move to talking about emotions and goals, and looking at how not just our consumption patterns change, but the feelings that we feel and the goals that we seek out, how those things change. And some of this work is done by Laura Carstensen at Stanford, who has really researched how people think about their feelings, how people feel feelings, and how people think about goals over the course of their lifetime. Now, why is this relevant? I'll explain why in a minute. She talks about the idea that when we have an open-ended time perspective, like when we're younger, we focus more on information-related goals. I'm not saying it's information graphs data. I'm saying we engage in things that get us information that put ourselves in a good position later on. So in other words, when we're younger, we might take classes, we might go to meetings and presentations that we may not want to be in, but they'll help us later on. With friends, we may have friends in our social group that are, you know, more instrumental to us. I'm not trying to be cynical here, but I'm saying younger people have large social networks, and some of the people in those networks just help us out later on. When we face a limited time perspective, we don't see a large open road in front of us, then we focus more on emotionally meaningful goals. We're not doing everything just to help us out in the future. We're doing things that bring us meaning. And some of this theorizing came about from looking at a paradox, which was that older people tend to have smaller social networks, but the people in those networks tend to be close, meaningful others, okay? They've pruned them down to focus on the people that give them meaning, the close family and the close friends. Younger people have these broader networks of friends, but not everybody in those friends are highly emotionally meaningful. Now, this is relevant here because I think a lot of what's happening right now is that people face a limited time perspective. They're facing a sense of endings in terms of the way that life was before this, endings in terms of who knows what time will be like moving forward, but also a heightened sense of mortality, if I can put my finger on it. This is clearly something that many people are experiencing right now as we hear more and more about death, dying, and stats that are grim. And so here's what we know from the research. Laura Carstensen and others developed a paradigm that I think is quite clever. And they asked people this question: if you had 30 minutes of free time and you could spend it with only one person, and assuming you could interact with another person, they didn't do this in the time of social distancing, but you get my idea. Who could you spend it with? Who would you spend it with? And they gave people three options. One was an author of a book you like, a recent acquaintance with whom you have a lot in common, and a member of your immediate family. And so we can clearly state that the member of your immediate family is a close other. The other two represent sort of information related goals. These are not people that we're close to, but they might help us out later on. Now, her research group, which I should admit I was a part of in grad school, but this is not my research here. They've given this types of question to thousands of people. And in particular, they looked at this as the answers to this question as it pertains to people at different times in their lives. So younger people, middle-aged people, older people, and time and again, they found that older people preferred the close emotional other. Younger people tended to be either indifferent or they preferred the recent acquaintance or the author of a book, okay? And yes, you could argue, well, maybe people's family members are annoying, but that's just noise in the data, okay? Now, here's what's interesting about this. They had data pre 9/11. So this was, I believe they had this in 1998, 1999. And you can look at the preference of people who are preferring close others. And what you see here, that the graph just shows you, as you move to the right on that graph, these are older groups. So hopefully you can see my mouse, the sort of light blue, that's people ages 36 to 55. This slightly bluer one over here, that's 56 and older. And I can go into the details for how they split the ages up, but however you really split it up, you see this pattern. These folks, as they were older, they focus more on the close other, okay, the close emotional other. Now, they realized they had this data, and right after 9/11, they actually called a whole new sample of people. There's no online research at this point. This is this is September 22nd, 2001. And now they look at the patterns and you actually see no differences, no statistically significant differences across the age groups. In other words, younger people are just as focused on the close emotional others as older people are, okay? They then surveyed people 4 months after 9/11, and the patterns went back to the way that they were pre 9/11. So, I think this highlights something interesting, which is that these are acute emotional reactions that we're having right now. And there's been a lot of talk of what will change forever in American society. And I think it would be, I think it's really meaningful to say that there's going to be some big changes, and I think there will. But whether or not we'll see people all across the lifespan preferring close emotional others, I don't think that'll happen. I think what we're going to see is that gradually over time, people will go back to normal. And I think that is actually something that is a silver lining of sorts as well. Now, by the way, they did this pre and post 9/11. They also did this in Hong Kong during the SARS peak and after the SARS peak, which might be the most relevant thing to right now. And so during the peak of SARS, again, you see no differences between age groups. In other words, people are experiencing limited time, endings are high, and mortality is salient, and now people are focused on close others. And I'm guessing that mimics your feelings right now too. After SARS, I believe it was 6 months later, and the results are a little harder to see here, but we see the similar pattern now where it goes back so that younger people tend to prefer the more novel partners and older people are significantly higher on focusing on the close others, okay? So that's one line of work. Let me just round out the talk by just talking about one other line of work, which focuses on not endings per se, but big life transitions. I think we can argue that what's happening right now represents a big transition. It represents a boundary of sorts between the way things were and the way things are, and who knows what the way things will be. And I have some work, again, with Adam Alter that I think speaks to this. It looks at what happens when people face big transitions and boundaries in their life. And namely, we looked at what happens when people turn a new sort of milestone age, when they turn 30, 40, 50, 60, et cetera, right? And the reason why we think this is important is because we know that round numbers tend to matter in our society. Round numbers, boundaries, these are psychologically significant. They're arbitrary to some extent. Like 30 isn't actually different from 29, but all of a sudden we're in our 30s. 40 is no different than 39, but all of a sudden you're in your 40s. If you want some evidence, just as an analogy, in baseball, which I know people are missing right now, this is a graph here that shows you at the end of the season how players end up in terms of their batting averages. And what you can see here is there's what we call a discontinuity, or a spike right over 300. And if batting averages were sort of normally distributed, you wouldn't see this, but the round number of 300 matters. And so players try harder to get there than sort of the other averages. We also see this, by the way, with high school kids and the SATs. This shows you how likely students are to retake the SAT, and they're more likely to retake it if they're just under a boundary than if they're over a boundary there, okay? And so what we wondered is, what happens when people face these big transitions in their lives when they're about to turn 40? So in other words, when they're 39, when they're about to turn 50, in other words, when they're 49, right? And one of the ideas that we had based on other work was that when people are facing these big transitions, they tend to take stock of their lives. They tend to question the meaningfulness of their lives. I don't mean everybody does this in a dark existential way. I just mean that these represent times where people wonder, how am I doing and how will things continue to go for me, okay? And so what we decided to look at was whether in fact people are questioning the meaning in their lives or seeking it out. And so there's a survey called the World Values Survey, which surveys tens of thousands of people around the world. It's done this for decades now. And we've looked at different waves here, and one of the questions people are asked is, how often do you question the meaning or the purpose of your life? And it's just a 4-point scale, ranging from never to often. And we looked at this across different ages. So people whose age ended in a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 9. And the idea was, as people approach these boundaries, that's when people should be seeking out and questioning meaning more. And in fact, what I'm going to show you here, this is the average sort of number here for the different ages. And then in yellow, this is where people were who were about to hit one of these transitions. And admittedly, these are small differences, but there's a lot that goes into our sort of seeking out of meaning. And this is significant. And so what we reasoned was, if you can see a little bit of this, and we're not the only ones who have picked up on this, others have found similar patterns. I just want to say this sort of pattern replicates. Well, if that's the case, then what happens as a result of seeking out or searching for meaning? And our rationale was that if we seek out meaning, if we're searching for it, then we may do things that will either sort of heighten our meaning, those are sort of adaptive pursuits, or may ironically kind of lead us to retreat into ourselves, maladaptive pursuits of meaning. In other words, when people are wondering how meaningful are their lives, they can either do things that will help or that might hurt. And so I'm going to show you 2 of the sort of negative things that we looked at. And then I'll show you 2 of the positive ones. And so, one way to think about this is that this is essentially a type of midlife crisis, but rather than one midlife crisis, it's a crisis that occurs with transitions to new decades. And so what's one of the classic things that happens with midlife crises, people talk about affairs. Now, of course, how do we actually get data on affairs? Well, that's really hard to come by. And I want to note, this is work from about five years ago. We were able to partner with Ashley Madison at the time. Ashley Madison is if you don't know it, that's probably a good thing, but Ashley Madison is a dating website for people who want extramarital affairs. And I should note that we spent so much time trying to get this data from them and going through the institutional review board, and then they finally gave us data on 8 million male users. And then like a year later, there was this massive data leak, and we were like, shit, we could have just waited a year and gotten all this for free. But so they give us all this data, and we can look then at the age at which people are when they sign up for their membership. And it turns out that there's significantly more people whose ages end in a 9, that is right before they turn these big decades. And we can acknowledge that maybe people aren't being truthful about their age on Ashley Madison. And we've done a lot in this research to try to figure that out. It turns out that people don't have a systematic way of lying about their age. It's not that people are lying to be at the 9. And we have some other work that I think gets around this. But this is just one piece of the puzzle. You know, in another sort of darker data point, we also looked at the suicide rate in the US over a 11-year period. And these are suicides per 100,000 people. And there's, again, a slight uptick in people who are facing these new decades. I don't want to focus too much on this because I think it is depressing, but I think it represents some of the sort of bizarre or difficult behavior that people may engage in when they're facing these sort of crises of meaning. But let's look at more positive things. We looked at one or two specific positive outcomes here. And this stemmed from some just observations we had. We looked at athletic pursuits. We looked at marathons. Turns out there's great data on marathoners out there. And so we were actually able to get these data. And by the way, there's no incentive to lie about your age. If anything, it's the opposite way, because if you claim that you're younger than you are, it's harder to win your bracket, right? So we looked at people who had run multiple marathons, and we can acknowledge that maybe people who run multiple marathons are crazy in some other way, but that's beside the point. We looked at people who ran multiple marathons around one of these big life transitions, and we looked at their times. And what was really interesting here, this is their finishing time on average at these different ages. When we looked at their marathon performance when they were about to hit one of these big decades, they were slightly faster. They were about 2% faster, suggesting maybe they're trying a little bit harder that year. This is a smaller sample. I think there was only 100 or 200 people that we could get who had multiple marathons here, and we could get all their data. But then we looked at this another way, and we looked at marathon signups, right? So first marathoners. And here the data is just for people at the different sort of ages here. And we saw this spike, so that right before people hit these big transitions, they're more likely to sign up for a marathon. If you put all this together, I just want to show you a couple data points there on what sort of things may happen when people face these big transitions. And rather than focus on the specific data points, I think the bigger picture is important, which is to say, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some questioning of meaning, some questioning and taking stock of life, some questioning of our norms and behaviors. And to the extent that some of those may change and can change for the better, would be one very positive outcome from this. To the extent that I think we've already seen some of that is heartening. And I'm not, and I really want to be clear, not to downplay the very serious and negative outcomes that are happening right now. But I do want to highlight that the psychology of what's happening right now, I think, can cause people to gravitate towards different sort of cultural experiences and products, but also at the same time, lead them to question what their lives mean and what they're doing if they can afford to do so, and how they might then tackle those sorts of questions. I just want to close. This is my email. And so, you can certainly follow up with questions. I know we're going to open it up to Q&A in a minute, but just as a note, because this is with the alumni group here, I could not have predicted that this sort of pandemic and having to shift everything online in the matter of an incredibly short period of time would serve to bring this Anderson community so much closer. I mean, the amount of contact I've had with IT alone, but in a really positive way, the amount of contact I've had with my other colleagues, the amount of contact I've had with my students, past and current, to try to figure this out and make this sort of a better experience has been really heartening. And I think that, to me, is one of the sort of adaptive things that we're seeing. So let me stop there. Jill, I guess I can switch to the questions, or do you want to?
Just go right over to Q&A. You can go right there, about 11 of them right now.
All right, great. So the first question is this: why don't people lean towards comedy in down economic times? Seem counterintuitive. Okay, I think that may have been misunderstood there. So people do in fact lean towards comedy. What I was looking at was what types of comedy people lean toward. And what the research was showing is that people are leaning toward the lighter, simpler comedy in the down economic times. And again, the research that I'm citing there is, these New Yorker cartoons we've looked at, but we can also look at, the types of comedic acts that have been popular at different periods of time. And, you saw the rise of a lot of like physical comedy, like Three Stooges type stuff in the 30s and 40s. Now I call that a very light, not complex type of comedy. And in the early 30s, during what was not a good period of time at all, you saw more of the rise of the darker sort of monologues in the 70s when the economy wasn't doing as well. So we can see what sort of things happen now. I mean, this is a massive natural experiment, and to be able to see what the trends were before and after with some space in the, hopefully in a matter of months or a year, will be illuminating here. Okay, so next question was, how is the consumer sentiment index quantified? Right, that's a great question. So they norm the index to 100s, and that is that was the score, I believe, in 1956 when the stock market was doing well, when unemployment rate was relatively low, when people had positive prospects. And so higher scores than that actually means that people are more positive about the economy than they even were then. Lower scores in the 80s, 70s suggest that there's darker times ahead. People are worried about the economy. Okay, so let's see. I may have misunderstood the bar chart for the light and heavy genre of books, but the crime and comedy categories are opposite of the trends. That's exactly right. So not every single genre sort of conform to this general pattern, and that's just data. Sometimes things don't conform. Now we don't have a reason for why that's the case, and we could certainly speculate about that. But that's one possibility. Okay, this one says fascinating presentation. I'll just put that out there so you guys could see that somebody liked it. Okay, so are these models controlled for gender and race? So I guess I'm trying to figure out which models we're talking about here. In the research we did on people's ages as they faced these big decades in their lives, we do control for gender, race. Not every single study has every demographic indicator, but for the most part, we do put that in there because you could imagine some of these things may change. Okay, this question is, what if during positive economic times, someone chooses to focus on positive emotions rather than darker ones? Is it possible that the former segment would outperform the latter? It seems that there could be an opportunity across from directing one's energy toward darker emotions. There absolutely could. And I think it's worth saying that, again, these are trends. There will be segments. Hopefully some of you took marketing from me or remember this. Of course, there's different segments, and some segments may be particularly prone to being willing to grapple with more complex, darker emotions in better times, and some may not. And the data I presented was looking at sort of these broad swaths. And what'll be interesting, what would be an interesting further examination would be what happens to the people who are, grapple with this stuff too much or not enough? Is there a right answer? Is there an optimal amount of grappling, if you will? So let's see. So some of the acute emotional reactions and behaviors may return to the norm after some time lapse. That's right. And so given that the U.S. has not experienced war on its own land or widespread epidemic, will the U.S.'s emotions and our behaviors rebound as quickly? I think this is a fascinating question. And, it's incredibly difficult to predict. Nothing about this is precedented. And so, the only things that I think, come close in the last probably 40 years are 9/11. Sorry, I said 40 years. Maybe that was egotistical or egocentric because that's how long I've been around. But just in terms of looking at sort of major events in the recent cultural perspective, 9/11 was one big one, but the bounce back took some time. But again, that was different because it was so local and it happened and it was over. And there was anxiety about will it happen again and will anthrax, be widespread, et cetera. But really, the country moved on. Now, there's some really interesting work that George Lowenstein has highlighted recently, suggesting that people who are at the center of tragedies actually recover faster than the people who are on the periphery. And the reason why is that when you're in the center of something, you've got a natural distraction. There's something that focuses you on that thing. The people on the periphery watch this terrible thing happen, but they don't have as much that they can do. And so part of the recommendation that he and others have made is, to try to find meaning, try to find purpose. This is why I think there's been a lot of encouragement to make masks and donate supplies, not just for the practical reason, but also for the psychological reason as well. Okay, so another, this is an observation, not a question, but it's a great observation, which is that clients in home improvement, DIY, Home Depot, Lowe's are actually doing pretty well right now during this shelter in place. And I would argue that the people who are going to Home Depot for home projects probably don't have small children at home, but that's a separate point. But I think it also hammers home this idea that people are looking for escapes right now. They're looking for, what else are you going to do, right? They're looking for escapes in the form of baking bread. They're looking for escapes in the form of home improvement of projects, et cetera. Okay, so this question I think is a fascinating one, and I would love to know what happens from this. How do our decisions currently impact work and career paths? And I think it's this is bearing on some of my own interests with Professor McGillner-Holmes, Cassie, who I think is giving one of these faculty chats in 2 weeks. We've been really interested in looking at how people make trade-offs between money and time. And when I say time, that's really time with others and time doing the things that they love. And sometimes we can't make these trade-offs, obviously, but sometimes we can. And the question will be whether people focus more on careers that can provide some emotional meaning or careers that are going to provide more resources. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that these are always traded off, right? It's not that the high-paying ones are not meaningful and vice versa. Sometimes it does seem that way anecdotally, but that's not always the case. It may be that people are focused on doing things that are meaningful, but there's a practical component of this too, which is with this, I guess we'll hear more about it from the forecast next Friday, right? But with the recession, what jobs will be available, what sort of things will people be able to do? That's going to be another question there entirely. Now, I think where this particular question will come in, where it'll be interesting, is what sort of career paths people take in a year or two or whenever the crisis is over. And that's going to be an open question. And that, if you could collaborate with the Parker Center to look at the types of things that people focus on pre pandemic and post, that would be how I would ask that question, right? With the increasing focus on life meaning, would you expect to see more ethical or sustainability focused consumerism? This is a fantastic question. We've already seen a lot of this. What the data suggests is that millennials and Gen Z, not everybody who's a millennial who is Gen Z is the same, but we see these trends where younger segments tend to be focused on corporate social responsibility and ethical consumption and sustainability more so than, say, Gen X, boomers, et cetera. And that's played out in interesting ways where firms are actually engaging in more corporate social responsibility. They're engaging more in these sorts of practices, both from an ethical and moral sense, but also from a bottom line sense, because they know that their younger consumers who have the higher customer lifetime value like these sorts of things. Now, whether that will get amplified or intensified will remain to be seen. I think the reason why I would suggest it might is that because the seeds were already planted, that may continue to be the case. Now, I would bet that would take some time to come back. Like the New York Times article that I spotlighted that focused on the flaming hot Cheetos. A lot of people who are giving up their more labor intensive, more expensive, sustainable practices, because these things are more expensive and it's easier to buy from processed food. It's cheaper and it's more comforting. Is that the ethical, moral choice? There's going to be debate about all these different things, right? But so when that sort of behavior comes back and how intensely, we'll have to see. Okay, so is there any data on group decision making during crises? I'm one of those spending my days in Zoom meetings dealing with future planning with my colleagues. And by one of those in Zoom meetings, you mean all of us, right? I probably should let some of my M&O colleagues speak to this one. But what we do know is groupthink. We know about groupthink. Whether groupthink is intensified in the midst of a crisis is not a question I know the answer to. The one bit of relevant research that I think speaks to this comes from, it's a literature on what's called terror management theory. It's the basic idea that we try to grapple with scary emotions, especially the ones surrounding mortality, by doing all sorts of things that can sort of symbolically allow us to live on, right? So the basic idea with this work is that when we're reminded of death, when we have mortality cues in the environment, then we try to focus on people who are in our in group rather than the out group. We focus on the people who are closer to us and pay more attention to them, but we also try to focus more on leaders who seem like they are decisive decision makers who can sort of protect us. This is what the research has found. And so this is maybe a little aside from this great question, but I think it's sort of suggesting that in these times we may actually want to gravitate towards more sort of leaders that can sort of make simple, decisive, quick decisions, especially in these group settings. This research found that was one possible explanation for George Bush's sort of overwhelming win over John Kerry, because he represented that type of figurehead, whereas John Kerry did not. This is back 2004, but immediately post 9/11. So question here, I looked at activities that sort of hiked up at the age of milestones. Do we find any activities that show a decrease at the milestones? We haven't looked at those. I would love to know what's out there and what we could find. I think it's a great research question that we could ask. Okay, do we have a relative gauge of the emotional pulse for this current time as compared to other sort of past traumatic events like 9/11, the Great Reception, et cetera? Is the emotional mood of this country during pandemic much worse now? I'd love to know the answer to that. Unfortunately, we don't have the, or maybe somebody does, but look, Twitter was in its infancy during the financial crisis, and social media, believe it or not, wasn't even around during 9/11. And those are the ways that I think those are the smart ways now to gauge mood in sort of a more implicit way. Now, of course, we could look at polls and surveys from Gallup and Pew, and I haven't looked at those. And so we can look at what sort of things people are saying and feeling. My only question with those that relies on more of an explicit self-report focus, and that's that's meaningful, but I think it's particularly meaningful to see what sort of things are people saying and talking about without even directly being asked. And we can't get that from 2008 and from 2001, but I'll be on the lookout for that sort of thing. Okay, so when we discuss how people prefer spending time with people who are emotionally close, how much of that is due to information seeking versus feeling like we don't have to perform or be on around those people? And I think that is a great question. Here's what the research would say is that I think all of this sort of plays into it. The research would say that when we focus on emotionally close others or emotionally close social partners, part of the reason we're doing that is because we don't have to put on airs. We can be ourselves. We don't have to be as frustrated or negative. We can spend time with them in a positive way. Now, I want to just make sure it's clear that emotionally meaningful doesn't mean hedonistic. Okay, it's not that when older adults focus on the emotional close others, that's because those are the people who they can party with. It's more that emotional meaning and value provides utility in its own way, and possibly more so than more sort of simple and short-lived happiness. So I think part of it is that close others allow us to be ourselves. And if we're sort of seeking out these other people that are more novel social partners or whatever, that could be information seeking. It also means it's a little bit more difficult for us. That may not be as emotionally meaningful. And so I think maybe I have time for one or two more questions.
Yeah, I would say probably one more question, but it would be great.
Great. So here's the last question. So I work in planned giving, and many of my colleagues are seeing significant increase in bequests documented and inquiries for information on estate planning. And this fits with what we discussed here and suggests that we're going to see that interest decline as normalcy returns. Yeah, I don't know the data. Anecdotally, I've been hearing more people reach out to their lawyers about estate planning. Anecdotally, I've also heard as well that there's been more conversations around bequests and philanthropic pursuits, and some of these are directly related to mortality salience. What am I gonna, what happens if I die? I want to make sure that my loose ends are tied up. But I think some of it's less pragmatic and more about this focus on meaning. What's important to me right now, and what do I want my life to mean later on? It's somewhat depressing to say, well, as normalcy returns, will this interest decline? And like I said earlier, I look at this two ways. One is that there's a lot of good things about normalcy, and if we go back to those things, that I think people would be happy. There's a lot of things that could change about our normal behaviors and our norms and patterns and whatnot. And so if one sort of offshoot of this whole thing is that people are more focused now on bequests and philanthropic pursuits, I think that would be a great thing. Whether that can be sustained or not is just going to be an open question that we don't know the answer to yet. Okay, let me turn it back over to Joe. This is great. I love these questions. I'm really happy to have done this, and so thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you. This was absolutely fabulous. It really gave us a lot of food for thought. I personally am going to start investing in weight loss programs in gyms, right? Because it'll be like after the holiday gluttony, everyone's going to have their COVID-19 pounds that they have to get rid of. But
not to mention their COVID-19 pounds.
That's exactly, yeah. So this was absolutely, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. As I mentioned to all the participants, we'll be sending you a link with the slide materials as well as a video of today's presentation. We have other Friday faculty chats coming up in the subsequent weeks. Next week is Jerry Nicholsburg and the UCLA Anderson forecast. So be safe, be healthy out there. Thank you again, Professor Hirschfield. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.